Hey, I'm Sean Chertel with CodePilot, and I'm here to talk to you today about Zjax. So Zjax is an interactivity library very similar to something like HTMX or Hotwire. It is also similar to something like Alpine because it actually does both. It handles interactivity for Ajax fetches from a server and swapping out parts of your DOM without refreshing the whole page. And it also does client-side JavaScript binding so that you can just do little actions like close a menu or dismiss a modal window or something like that. It's 4.9 kilobytes. It's a very small little library, especially since it handles both of those things. So to install it, you simply put that script tag in your head to pull it in from the CDN. And it gives you a ZSwap attribute and a ZAction attribute. And that's all it does. It just gives you those two attributes. So here's what they look like. A ZSwap attribute, for example, if you added it to a button, you would just give it a value that includes the trigger event and then the handler. And we'll talk about what that handler looks like in a minute. It's the same format for a ZAction. If you're just doing client-side interactivity that doesn't require a round trip to the server, you'll use a ZAction instead of a ZSwap. Basically the same format. The handler will be different, but the trigger will be the same. Any standard browser event can be used as your trigger. You just want to prefix it with an @ sign, and then any of the standard ones will work. You can also add modifiers. Zjax gives you modifiers. For example, if you're listening for an input on a form field, you might want to debounce that so that you're not just flooding your application with events. You can do that very easily with Zjax modifiers. All these modifiers are in the docs. You just go to zjax.dev and you can see all of the modifiers that are available. There are a lot of them that are pretty handy. Another example would be for a key down. You might want to listen on the window object, and you might want to specify which key you're listening for. That's pretty easy to do as well. In addition to that, there are special events that aren't real browser events. One very useful one is mount. So anytime this element appears in the DOM, this event will fire. And you can even specify more than one event at a time, just using kind of an array-like syntax like this. So these can all be used in both ZSwap attributes as well as ZAction attributes. And it's the same syntax for both. Let's start by talking about ZSwap. So ZSwap, when used in your code, is going to look like this. You'll start with the trigger event, and then you'll give it the handler. And like I said, the handlers are a little different for a swap versus an action. Let's start by looking at the format of a ZSwap handler. It basically takes two things, your endpoint and the elements that you want to swap. So your endpoint would be, for example, /products, and the element that you want to swap would be, for example, you want to swap out the incoming cart element for the local cart element. So it basically just means go get this whole endpoint, pluck out the thing I need, and stick it into my DOM. And if you want to be super efficient, you can make your endpoint so that it only returns, in this example, the cart element. But it really doesn't matter. You know, if you're getting a little extra HTML back with your response that we disregard, not a big deal. It's not gonna kill you probably. If you're really worried about it, you can make those endpoints be as efficient as you like. And if you wanted to add an HTTP endpoint, you could do that. In most cases, it's not necessary because we're usually using the get HTTP method. Did I say endpoint before? I meant method. Anyway, there are cases, though, where you do need to specify the method. For example, on a form, you might listen for the submit event, and then you'll want to probably send that as a post. So you could do that just as easily there. Let's take a look at a demo. So I've got a really simple little application set up here. It's just 4 files. We've got an index. We've got a file named squares, which is just 3 squares, and a file named circles, which is just 3 circles, and then my style that makes them look like squares and circles with different colored backgrounds. So that's it. That's the whole project. Super simple. In the head of our document here, we're pulling in the Zjax library, and we're also pulling in simple CSS, just so that it looks a little nicer while we're working here. And then we're pulling in my styles to make those squares and circles. And the body you can see is super simple. It's just this h1, and then we have an empty content div. And that's the whole application. The first thing I want to do is I want to use Zjax to pull in the squares into this content on mount. So we'll start with a ZSwap attribute, and the trigger is going to be mount. The endpoint is going to be squares. And by the way, Vite is handling this routing for us, but don't worry about that. You don't have to use Vite, obviously. And the thing that we're going to swap out is called squares. That's the element. If we go look at that, this is the squares endpoint, and this is the thing that we want to swap in. However, you might already be noticing a problem here. What this specifies to Zjax is find the squares element in the response and use it to replace the squares element in our local DOM. We don't have a squares element in the local DOM, so we're going to hit an error. But let's go ahead and look at that. So I just hit save, and the mount trigger fired, and it caused an error. So this is Zjax error. Tells us exactly what happened. It's unable to execute the ZSwap function. The target node squares does not exist in the local DOM. So we've asked it to do something impossible, and it rightly refused to do it. So what we actually want to do, though, is grab these squares, and we want it to replace the content. So now we get into a slightly more advanced syntax. We use a dash greater than, and that way we can specify the response element and the local element. So the response element is squares. We want that to come into the local element content. So I'm going to hit save, and now that works. So we've pulled in the squares. All right, so that's pretty cool. Now that these squares have been pulled in, I would like to make it so that when I click on this square, it goes to the circles endpoint, grabs the first circle, and uses it to replace this square. So in other words, click the square, it turns into a circle. So let's see how we would do that. Okay, so we'll start by adding a ZSwap attribute. The trigger is a click, the endpoint is circles. The response element we're looking for is circle 1. And we want to put that into square 1. Refresh the page, click on square 1, and it turns into a circle. The effect is spa-like. It just turns into a circle. What really happened is it made a request to the server. It got the whole circles page back, and then it just plucked out the element we want and put it where we wanted it. Let's get a little fancier, though. Remember, just because we want something to happen when we click on this square, I'm going to refresh, when we click on this square, it doesn't mean it has to happen to this element necessarily. It could happen to anywhere else on the page. What if we wanted to change this so that circle 2 came in and replaced square 2? So this one's going to change when we click on this one. Let's try that, and there we go. What if we wanted both of these elements to change? Now, this is one thing that Zjax makes very easy. It is common to want to change more than one element at a time. That comes built in for Zjax. You literally just use a comma and specify the other elements. So in this case, circle 3 to square 3. And this time I'll remember to refresh first, click on 1, and 2 and 3 change. There are other neat things you can do. For example, maybe instead of replacing square 3, which is the default, maybe we actually want to put it after square 3. Can we do that? Let's try it. We'll refresh over here, click on 1, and it worked. It actually added it after. We could change that to before. And click on square 1, and it came before square 3. Okay, so now let's talk about Z-action. Z-action is going to be a very similar syntax. It's always, of course, going to start with the trigger event and then the handler. Handler syntax is a little bit different, as you might expect. One of the things you can do with Z-action is literally just write some arbitrary JavaScript right in line. This will actually work. On the click, it will alert. And of course, you get the full menu of available trigger events, including modifiers. So one of the modifiers, just as an example here, would be click.outside. In that case, if you clicked anywhere outside of this button, it would alert hello. So this is very handy. And let's talk about triggers for just a second, because one of the great things about the way that Zjax handles triggers for you is trigger events. Normally you would add an event listener, and you need to remember to remove those. You need to keep track of them all and remove them when your elements leave the DOM. Otherwise they can start building up and cause memory leaks. Zjax handles all that stuff for you. So when you're using ZSwap and ZAction to bind interactivity to events, you don't have to worry about memory leaks or managing your event listeners at all, because Zjax takes care of all of that for you. And that's true for both ZSwap and ZAction. In addition to just putting arbitrary inline JavaScript right there in your ZAction value, you can also give it a function name, something like this. In order for that to work, you would need to define that, and you do that with zjax.actions. So it looks like this. Anywhere in your project, you've got this global Zjax object available. You just call the actions function and give it an object with your action functions. Obviously, you can do more than one, and once these are defined in there, you can just use them directly in your ZActions. You can refer to them. So let's take a look at some examples of ZActions. So we're looking at our code again. Let's take a moment to appreciate what's going on here with the Hypermedia style of coding that's happening. So in the olden days, when Tim Berners-Lee invented the internet, he came up with this really cool idea called Hypermedia. And it meant that the media that you are getting into your browser itself has hypermedia controls that can do other stuff. So for example, if you have a link, you click on it, it pulls in a resource that has a bunch of other links. Those links will also work, and then that can go on and on forever. So Zjax, being a hypermedia library, follows the same principles. And so we can sort of already see that in action. If we look at our index page here, on mount, it's pulling in these squares. And those squares, because we added this ZSwap here, those squares themselves have hypermedia controls. In this case, a ZSwap. And so once that comes into the DOM, this gets parsed too and will still work. And so what this does is, as we've already seen, when we click on square 1, it swaps out circle 2, circle 3. Now let's take this a step further. Let's put on circle 2, let's say. Let's go ahead and add a ZAction. So we'll start with an example that is the same as what we've already seen here. Let's just say on click, we want to alert hello. So I'm going to refresh, click on 1, that pulls in circle 2 and 3, and circle 2, if I click on it, gives us the alert of hello. And we can also see an example of calling an action function, a named action. So in this case, we'll say hello. And at first, let's just see what happens here. If I click on 1, circle 2 came in with this on it. Before I even click it, it already tells us this isn't going to work. It can't find the action say hello because we haven't defined it. And so we need to go somewhere in our code. Now remember, because we've pulled in Zjax, one of the things that does is give us a global Zjax object. It's actually on the window object, so it's available globally. What we can do here is just add another script tag and use Zjax actions. It is a function and it takes an object, and we can give it as many action functions as we want. We need a say hello function. And all we're going to do here is this time we'll console log it instead of alerting. Click on 1, that brought in number 2, which should have this action on it. And it does. It says hello right there. So this is just a simple example, but I want you to understand that inside of this function, we could put as much code as we want. We could make calls to remote APIs. By the way, these can be async functions, and the await will automatically be handled for us. there's really quite a lot that you can do. And one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the fact that Zjax gives us a special jQuery-like object for use in actions, and it's a $sign. So when you're writing a function, you can receive the $sign, and you can do things like use a selector to find an element. We'll say we want to remove square one. So we can find square one, and that will return the DOM element, and now we can just use regular JavaScript on it to remove it. So let's see if that works. Now remember, this say hello function is attached to circle 2. So we're going to need to click on circle 2 to see that work. So click on circle 2, and it removed square one from the DOM. You can also, there are a couple of other things, and again, don't try to memorize all this. This is all in the docs. There are a couple of nice little functions on here. One of them is redirect. We can redirect, for example, to another web page if we want to. Let's give that a protocol too, or I don't think it'll work. Click on 1, that pulls in circles 2 and 3. Click on circle 2, and it redirects us to another web page. So all in the docs, lots of power in here when you combine especially async await stuff with this handy little $sign helper. One last thing I want to point out actually before we wrap up this section, you can use that $sign syntax right here in line as well. So we could say @click, let's just remove the self. Let's remove this thing. And I'm going to show you that in just a second too. There's something special here. Click on 1 to bring in the circles. This is the one that has the Z action attached to it. Click on it and it disappears. The thing I wanted to show you is that we can use this $sign parentheses syntax to find an element in the DOM, but we can also skip the selector and that will refer to this element. So it should be the same exact effect here. If I click on 1 to bring in circles 2 and 3, click on circle 2 and it gets removed. You could also do things like add a class, for example, if you wanted to. Maybe it becomes active. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's just go into the styles and say anything that has a class of active is going to get a, let's say a 10 pixel green border. No, solid green. See if that works. Live coding. What could go wrong? Oh, I know what I did wrong. It's not add class, it's class list.add. So let's try that. Class list. Is that right? Yes, it is. So you can see that you could get very sophisticated here. Once your inline stuff starts getting too crazy, if you wanted to do a bunch of stuff like remove a couple of elements and add classes to a few elements and make an API call, and depending on the results of that API call, maybe toggle some different classes. Once things start getting complex, you'll reach a point where you're like, okay, we need to take all this code out of here, give it a name instead, and then just go make that function to do all that stuff. So that is an overview of Z action. So that's Zjax in a nutshell. You can go to zjax.dev for more information. And if you want to learn more about CodePilot, you can find out more about us at codepilot.com. Thanks for watching.